in history, if milk is set to boil in a saucepan, it boils over. I do not know, and have never wanted to know, why this happens. If pressed, I should probably attribute it to a propensity in milk to boil over, which is true enough but explains nothing. But then I am not a natural scientist. In the same way, one can read, or even write, about the events of the past without wanting to know why they happened, or be content to say that the Second World War occurred because Hitler wanted war, which is true enough but explains nothing. But one should not then commit the solecism of calling oneself a student of history or a historian. The study of history is a study of causes. The historian, as I said at the end of my last lecture, continuously asks the question, why? And, so long as he hopes for an answer, he cannot rest. The great historian, or perhaps I should say more broadly, the great thinker, is the man who asks the question, why, about new things or in new contexts. Herodotus, the father of history, defined his purpose in the opening of his work, to preserve a memory of the deeds of the Greeks and the barbarians, and in particular, beyond everything else, to give the cause of their fighting one another. He found few disciples in the ancient world. Even Thucydides has been accused of having no clear conception of causation. 1 But when in the 18th century the foundations of modern historiography began to be laid, Montesquieu, in his considerations on the causes of the greatness of the Romans and of their rise and decline, took as his starting point the principles that there are general causes, moral or physical, which operate in every monarchy, raise it, maintain it, or overthrow it, and that all that occurs is subject to these causes. A few years later in the Esprit des Lois he developed and generalized this idea. It was absurd to suppose that blind fate has produced all the effects which we see in the world. Men were not governed uniquely by their fantasies, their behavior followed certain laws or principles derived from the nature of things. 2 For nearly 200 years after that, historians and philosophers of history were busily engaged in an attempt to organize the past experience of mankind by discovering the causes of historical events and the laws which governed them. Sometimes the causes and the laws were thought of in mechanical, sometimes in biological, terms, sometimes as metaphysical, sometimes as economic, sometimes as psychological. But it was accepted doctrine that history consisted in marshalling the events of the past in an orderly sequence of cause and effect. If you have nothing to tell yous, wrote Voltaire in his article on history for the Encyclopedia, except that one barbarian succeeded another on the banks of the Oxus and Jaxartes, what is that to us? In the last years the picture has been somewhat modified. Nowadays, for reasons discussed in my last lecture, we no longer speak of historical laws, and even the word cause has gone out of fashion, partly owing to certain philosophical ambiguities into which I need not enter, and partly owing to its supposed association with determinism, to which I will come presently. Some people therefore speak not of cause, in history, but of explanation, or interpretation, or of the logic of the situation, or of the inner logic of events. This comes from Dicey, or reject the causal approach why it happened, in favor of the functional approach how it happened, though this seems inevitably to involve the question how it came to happen, and so leads us back to the question, why? Other people distinguish between different kinds of cause, mechanical, biological, psychological and so forth, and regard historical cause as a category of its own. Though some of these distinctions are in some degree valid, it may be more profitable for present purposes to stress what is common to all kinds of cause, than what separates them. For myself, I shall be content to use the word cause, in the popular sense and neglect these particular refinements. Let us begin by asking what the historian in practice does when he is confronted by the necessity of assigning causes to events. The first characteristic of the historian's approach to the problem of cause is that he will commonly assign several causes to the same event. Marshall the economist once wrote that, people must be warned off by every possible means from considering the action of any one cause, without taking account of the others whose effects are commingled with it. Point 3 The examination candidate who, in answering the question, why did revolution break out in Russia in 1917, offered only one cause, would be lucky to get a third class. The historian deals in a multiplicity of causes. If he were required to consider the causes of the Bolshevik Revolution, he might name Russia's successive military defeats, the collapse of the Russian economy under pressure of war, the effective propaganda of the Bolsheviks, the failure of the Tsarist government to solve the agrarian problem, the concentration of an impoverished and exploited proletariat in the factories of Petrograd, the fact that Lenin knew his own mind and nobody on the other side did, in short, a random jumble of economic, political, ideological and personal causes, of long-term and short-term causes. But this brings us at once to the second characteristic of the historian's approach. The candidate who, in reply to our question, was content to set out one after the other a dozen causes of the Russian Revolution and leave it at that, might get a second class, but scarcely a first, well-informed, but unimaginative, would probably be the verdict of the examiners. The true historian, confronted with this list of causes of his own compiling, would feel a professional compulsion to reduce it to order, to establish some hierarchy of causes which would fix their relation to one another, perhaps to decide which cause, or which category of causes, should be regarded, in the last resort, or, in the final analysis, favorite phrases of historians, as the ultimate cause, the cause of all causes. This is his interpretation of his theme. The historian is known by the causes which he invokes. Gibbon attributed the decline and fall of the Roman Empire to the triumph of barbarism and religion. The English Whig historians of the 19th century attributed the rise of British power and prosperity to the development of political institutions embodying the principles of constitutional liberty. Gibbon and the English 19th century historians have an old-fashioned look today because they ignore the economic causes which modern historians have moved into the forefront. Every historical argument revolves round the question of the priority of causes. Henri Poincaré, in the work which I quoted in my last lecture, noted that science was advancing simultaneously, towards variety and complexity, and, towards unity and simplicity, and that this dual and apparently contradictory process was a necessary condition of knowledge. Point 4. This is no less true of history. The historian, by expanding and deepening his research, constantly accumulates more and more answers to the question, why? The proliferation in recent years of economic, social, cultural and legal history, not to mention fresh insights into the complexities of political history, and the new techniques of psychology and statistics, have enormously increased the number and range of our answers. When Bertrand Russell observed that, every advance in a science takes us further away from the crude uniformities which are first observed into a greater differentiation of antecedent and consequent and into a continually wider circle of antecedents recognized as relevant. 5. He accurately described the situation in history. But the historian, in virtue of his urge to understand the past, is simultaneously compelled, like the scientist, to simplify the multiplicity of his answers, to subordinate one answer to another, and to introduce some order and unity into the chaos of happenings and the chaos of specific causes. One God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event, or Henry Adams's quest for some great generalization which would finish one's clamor to be educated. 6. These read nowadays like old-fashioned jokes. But the fact remains that the historian must work through the simplification, as well as through the multiplication, of causes. History, like science, advances through this dual and apparently contradictory process. At this point I must reluctantly turn aside to deal with two savory red herrings which have been drawn across our path, one labeled, Determinism in History, or the Wickedness of Hegel, the other, Chance in History, or Cleopatra's Nose. First I must say a word or two about how they come to be here. Professor Karl Popper, who in the 1930s in Vienna wrote a weighty work on the new look in science, recently translated into English under the title The Logic of Scientific Enquiry, published in English during the war 2 books of a more popular character, The Open Society and Its Enemies and the Poverty of Historicism. 7. They were written under the strong emotional influence of the reaction against Hegel, who was treated, together with Plato, as the spiritual ancestor of Nazism, and against the rather shallow Marxism which was the intellectual climate of the British left in the 1930s. The principal targets were the allegedly determinist philosophies of history of Hegel and Marx grouped together under the opprobrious name of historicism. 8. In 1954 Sir Isaiah Berlin published his essay on historical inevitability. He dropped the attack on Plato, perhaps out of some lingering respect for that ancient pillar of the Oxford establishment. 9. And he added to the indictment the argument, not found in Popper, that the historicism, of Hegel and Marx is objectionable because, by explaining human actions in causal terms, it implies a denial of human free will, and encourages historians to evade their supposed obligation, of which I spoke in my last lecture, to pronounce moral condemnation on the Charlemagnes, Napoleons and Stalins of history. Otherwise not much has changed. But Sir Isaiah Berlin is a deservedly popular and widely read writer. During the past 5 or 6 years, almost everyone in this country or in the United States who has written an article about history, or even a serious review of a historical work, has cocked a knowing snook at Hegel and Marx and determinism, and pointed out the absurdity of failing to recognize the role of accident in history. It is perhaps unfair to hold Sir Isaiah responsible for his disciples. Even when he talks nonsense, he earns our indulgence by talking it in an engaging and attractive way. The disciples repeat the nonsense, and fail to make it attractive. In any case, there is nothing new in all this. Charles Kingsley, not the most distinguished of our Regius professors of modern history, who had probably never read Hegel or heard of Marx, spoke in his inaugural lecture in 1860 of man's mysterious power of breaking the laws of his own being, is proof that no inevitable sequence could exist in history. 10, but fortunately we had forgotten Kingsley. It is Professor Popper and Sir Isaiah Berlin who between them have flogged this very dead horse back into a semblance of life, and some patience will be required to clear up the muddle. First then let me take determinism, which I will define, I hope, uncontroversially, as the belief that everything that happens has a cause or causes, and could not have happened differently unless something in the cause or causes had also been different. 11 Determinism is a problem not of history, but of all human behavior. The human being whose actions have no cause and are therefore undetermined is as much an abstraction as the individual outside society whom we discussed in a previous lecture. Professor Popper's assertion that everything is possible in human affairs 12 is either meaningless or false. Nobody in ordinary life believes or can believe this. The axiom that everything has a cause is a condition of our capacity to understand what is going on around us. 13 The nightmare quality of Kafka's novels lies in the fact that nothing that happens has any apparent cause, or any cause that can be ascertained. This leads to the total disintegration of the human personality, which is based on the assumption that events have causes, and that enough of these causes are ascertainable to build up in the human mind a pattern of past and present sufficiently coherent to serve as a guide to action. Everyday life would be impossible unless one assumed that human behavior was determined by causes which are in principle ascertainable. Once upon a time some people thought it blasphemous to inquire into the causes of natural phenomena, since these were obviously governed by the divine will. Sir Isaiah Berlin's objection to our explaining why human beings acted as they did, on the ground that these actions are governed by the human will, belongs to the same order of ideas, and perhaps indicates that the social sciences are in the same stage of development today as were the natural sciences when this kind of argument was directed against them. Let us see how we handle this problem in everyday life. As you go about your daily affairs, you are in the habit of meeting Smith. You greet him with an amiable, but pointless, remark about the weather, or about the state of college or university business. He replies with an equally amiable and pointless remark about the weather or the state of business. But supposing that one morning Smith, instead of answering your remark in his usual way, were to break into a violent diatribe against your personal appearance or character. Would you shrug your shoulders, and treat this as a convincing demonstration of the freedom of Smith's will and of the fact that everything is possible in human affairs? I suspect that you would not. On the contrary, you would probably say something like, "Poor Smith. You know, of course, his father died in a mental hospital," or, "Poor Smith. He must have been having more trouble with his wife." In other words, you would attempt to diagnose the cause of Smith's apparently causeless behavior in the firm conviction that some cause there must be. By so doing you would, I fear, incur the wrath of Sir Isaiah Berlin, who would bitterly complain that, by providing a causal explanation of Smith's behavior, you had swallowed Hegel's and Marx's deterministic assumption, and shirked your obligation to denounce Smith as a cad. But nobody in ordinary life takes this view, or supposes that either determinism or moral responsibility is at stake. The logical dilemma about free will and determinism does not arise in real life. It is not that some human actions are free and others determined. The fact is that all human actions are both free and determined, according to the point of view from which one considers them. The practical question is different again. Smith's action had a cause, or a number of causes, but insofar as it was caused not by some external compulsion, but by the compulsion of his own personality, he was morally responsible, since it is a condition of social life that normal adult human beings are morally responsible for their own personality. Whether to hold him responsible in this particular case is a matter for your practical judgment. But, if you do, this does not mean that you regard his action as having no cause. Cause and moral responsibility are different categories. An institute and chair of criminology have recently been established in this university. It would not, I feel sure, occur to any of those engaged in investigating the causes of crime to suppose that this committed them to a denial of the moral responsibility of the criminal. Now let us look at the historian. Like the ordinary man, he believes that human actions have causes which are in principle ascertainable. History, like everyday life, would be impossible if this assumption were not made. It is the special function of the historian to investigate these causes. This may be thought to give him a special interest in the determined aspect of human behavior, but he does not reject free will, except on the untenable hypothesis that voluntary actions have no cause. Nor is he troubled by the question of inevitability. Historians, like other people, sometimes fall into rhetorical language and speak of an occurrence as inevitable, when they mean merely that the conjunction of factors leading one to expect it was overwhelmingly strong. Recently I searched my own history for the offending word, and cannot give myself an entirely clean bill of health. In one passage I wrote that, after the revolution of 1917, a clash between the Bolsheviks and the Orthodox Church was inevitable. No doubt it would have been wiser to say, extremely probable. But may I be excused for finding the correction a shade pedantic? In practice, historians do not assume that events are inevitable before they have taken place. They frequently discuss alternative courses available to the actors in the story on the assumption that the option was open, though they go on quite correctly to explain why one course was eventually chosen rather than the other. Nothing in history is inevitable except in the formal sense that, for it to have happened otherwise, the antecedent causes would have had to be different. As a historian, I am perfectly prepared to do without inevitable, unavoidable, inescapable, and even ineluctable. Life will be drabber. But let us leave them to poets and metaphysicians. So barren and pointless does this charge of inevitability appear, and so great the vehemence with which it has been pursued in recent years, that I think we must look for the hidden motives behind it. Its principal source is, I suspect, what I may call the might have been school of thought, or rather of emotion. It attaches itself almost exclusively to contemporary history. Last term here in Cambridge I saw a talk to some society advertised under the title, Was the Russian Revolution Inevitable? I am sure it was intended as a perfectly serious talk. But if you had seen a talk advertised on, Were the Wars of the Roses Inevitable, you would at once have suspected some joke. The historian writes of the Norman Conquest or the American War of Independence as if what happened was in fact bound to happen, and as if it was his business simply to explain what happened and why, and nobody accuses him of being a determinist and of failing to discuss the alternative possibility that William the Conqueror or the American insurgents might have been defeated. When, however, I write about the Russian Revolution of 1917 in precisely this way, the only proper way to the historian, I find myself under attack from my critics for having by implication depicted what happened as something that was bound to happen, and failed to examine all the other things that might have happened. Suppose, it is said, that Stolypin had had time to complete his agrarian reform, or that Russia had not gone to war, perhaps the revolution would not have occurred, or suppose that the Kerensky government had made good, and that the leadership of the revolution had been assumed by the Mensheviks or the social revolutionaries instead of by the Bolsheviks. These suppositions are theoretically conceivable, and one can always play a parlor game with the might-have-beens of history. But they have nothing to do with determinism, for the determinist will only reply that, for these things to have happened, the causes would also have had to be different. Nor have they anything to do with history. The point is that today nobody seriously wishes to reverse the results of the Norman Conquest or of American independence or to express a passionate protest against these events, and nobody objects when the historian treats them as a closed chapter. But plenty of people, who have suffered directly or vicariously from the results of the Bolshevik victory, or still fear its remoter consequences, desire to register their protest against it, and this takes the form, when they read history, of letting their imagination run riot on all the more agreeable things that might have happened, and of being indignant with the historian who goes on quietly with his job of explaining what did happen and why their agreeable wish dreams remain unfulfilled. The trouble about contemporary history is that people remember the time when all the options were still open, and find it difficult to adopt the attitude of the historian for whom they have been closed by the fait accompli. This is a purely emotional and unhistorical reaction. But it has furnished most of the fuel for the recent campaign against the supposed doctrine of historical inevitability. Let us get rid of this red herring once and for all. The other source of the attack is the famous crux of Cleopatra's Nose. This is the theory that history is, by and large, a chapter of accidents, a series of events determined by chance coincidences, and attributable only to the most casual causes. The result of the Battle of Actium was due not to the sort of causes commonly postulated by historians, but to Antony's infatuation with Cleopatra. When Bajazet was deterred by an attack of gout from marching into Central Europe, Gibbon observed that, an acrimonious humor falling on a single fiber of one man may prevent or suspend the misery of nations. 14 When King Alexander of Greece died in the autumn of 1920 from the bite of a pet monkey, this accident touched off a train of events which led Sir Winston Churchill to remark that, 250,000 persons died of this monkey's bite. 15 Or take again Trotsky's comment on the fever contracted while shooting ducks, which put him out of action at a critical point of his quarrel with Zinoviev, Kamenev and Stalin in the autumn of 1923. One can foresee a revolution or a war, but it is impossible to foresee the consequences of an autumn shooting trip for wild ducks. 16 The first thing to be made clear is that this question has nothing to do with the issue of determinism. Antony's infatuation with Cleopatra, or Bajazet's attack of gout, or Trotsky's feverish chill, were just as much causally determined as anything else that happens. It is unnecessarily discourteous to Cleopatra's beauty to suggest that Antony's infatuation had no cause. The connection between female beauty and male infatuation is one of the most regular sequences of cause and effect observable in everyday life. These so-called accidents in history represent a sequence of cause and effect interrupting, and, so to speak, clashing with, the sequence which the historian is primarily concerned to investigate. Barry, quite rightly, speaks of a collision of two independent causal chains. 17 Sir Isaiah Berlin, who opens his essay on historical inevitability by citing with praise an article of Bernard Berenson on the accidental view of history, is one of those who confuse accident in this sense with an absence of causal determination. But, this confusion apart, we have a real problem on our hands. How can one discover in history a coherent sequence of cause and effect? How can we find any meaning in history, when our sequence is liable to be broken or deflected at any moment by some other, and from our point of view irrelevant, sequence? We may pause here for a moment to notice the origin of this recent widespread insistence on the role of chance in history. Polybius appears to have been the first historian to occupy himself with it in any systematic way, and Gibbon was quick to unmask the reason. The Greeks, observed Gibbon, after their country had been reduced to a province, imputed the triumphs of Rome not to the merit, but to the fortune, of the Republic. 18 Tacitus, also a historian of the decay of his country, was another ancient historian to indulge in extensive reflections on chance. The renewed insistence by British writers on the importance of accident in history dates from the growth of a mood of uncertainty and apprehension which set in with the present century and became marked after 1914. The first British historian to sound this note after a long interval appears to have been Barry, who, in an article of 1909 on Darwinism in History, drew attention to the element of chance coincidence, which in large measure helps to determine events in social evolution, and a separate article was devoted to this theme in 1916 under the title, Cleopatra's Nose. 19H. Fisher in the passage already quoted, which reflects his disillusionment over the failure of liberal dreams after the First World War, begs his readers to recognize the play of the contingent and the unforeseen in history. 20 The popularity in this country of a theory of history as a chapter of accidents has coincided with the rise in France of a school of philosophers who preach that existence, I quote Sartre's famous Later et la Néant, has neither cause nor reason nor necessity. In Germany, the veteran historian Meinecke, as we have already noted, became impressed towards the end of his life with the role of chance in history. He reproached rank with not having paid sufficient attention to it, and after the Second World War he attributed the national disasters of the past 40 years to a series of accidents: the vanity of the Kaiser, the election of Hindenburg to the presidency of the Weimar Republic, Hitler's obsessional character, and so forth. The bankruptcy of a great historian's mind under the stress of the misfortunes of his country. 21 In a group or a nation which is riding in the trough, not on the crest, of historical events, theories that stress the role of chance or accident in history will be found to prevail. The view that examination results are all a lottery will always be popular among those who have been placed in the third class. But to uncover the sources of a belief is not to dispose of it, and we have still but to uncover the sources of a belief is not to dispose of it, and we have still to discover exactly what Cleopatra's nose is doing in the pages of history. Montesquieu was apparently the first who attempted to defend the laws of history against this intrusion. If a particular cause, like the accidental result of a battle, has ruined a state, he wrote in his work on the greatness and decline of the Romans, there was a general cause which made the downfall of this state ensue from a single battle. The Marxists also had some difficulty over this question. Marx wrote of it only once, and that only in a letter. World history would have a very mystical character if there were no room in it for chance. This chance itself naturally becomes part of the general trend of development and is compensated by other forms of chance. But acceleration and retardation depend on such accidentals, which include the chance character of the individuals who are at the head of a movement at the outset. 22 Marx thus offered an apology for chance in history under three heads. First, it was not very important, it could accelerate, or retard, but not, by implication, radically alter, the course of events. Second, one chance was compensated by another, so that in the end chance cancelled itself out. Third, chance was especially illustrated in the character of individuals. 23 Trotsky reinforced the theory of compensating and self-canceling accidents by an ingenious analogy: the entire historical process is a refraction of historical law through the accidental. In the language of biology, we might say that the historical law is realized through the natural selection of accidents. 24 I confess that I find this theory unsatisfying and unconvincing. The role of accident in history is nowadays seriously exaggerated by those who are interested to stress its importance. But it exists, and to say that it merely accelerates or retards, but does not alter, is to juggle with words. Nor do I see any reason to believe that an accidental occurrence, say, the premature death of Lenin at the age of 54, is automatically compensated by some other accident in such a way as to restore the balance of the historical process. Equally inadequate is the view that accident in history is merely the measure of our ignorance, simply a name for something which we fail to understand. 25 This no doubt sometimes happens. The planets got their name, which means of course, wanderers, when they were supposed to wander at random through the sky, and the regularity of their movements was not understood. To describe something as a mischance is a favorite way of exempting oneself from the tiresome obligation to investigate its cause, and, when somebody tells me that history is a chapter of accidents, I tend to suspect him of intellectual laziness or low intellectual vitality. It is common practice with serious historians to point out that something hitherto treated as accidental was not an accident at all, but can be rationally explained and significantly fitted into the broader pattern of events. But this also does not fully answer our question. Accident is not simply something which we fail to understand. The solution of the problem of accident in history must, I believe, be sought in a quite different order of ideas. At an earlier stage we saw that history begins with the selection and marshalling of facts by the historian to become historical facts. Not all facts are historical facts. But the distinction between historical and unhistorical facts is not rigid or constant, and any fact may, so to speak, be promoted to the status of an historical fact once its relevance and significance is discerned. We now see that a somewhat similar process is at work in the historian's approach to causes. The relation of the historian to his causes has the same dual and reciprocal character as the relation of the historian to his facts. The causes determine his interpretation of the historical process, and his interpretation determines his selection and marshalling of the causes. The hierarchy of causes, the relative significance of one cause or set of causes or of another, is the essence of his interpretation. And this furnishes the clue to the problem of the accidental in history. The shape of Cleopatra's nose, Bajazet's attack of gout, the monkey bite that killed King Alexander, the death of Lenin, these were accidents which modified the course of history. It is futile to attempt to spirit them away, or to pretend that in some way or other they had no effect. On the other hand, insofar as they were accidental, they do not enter into any rational interpretation of history, or into the historian's hierarchy of significant causes. Professor Popper and Professor Berlin, I cite them once more as the most distinguished and widely read representatives of the school, assume that the historian's attempt to find significance in the historical process and to draw conclusions from it is tantamount to an attempt to reduce the whole of experience to a symmetrical order, and that the presence of accident in history dooms any such attempt to failure. But no sane historian pretends to do anything so fantastic as to embrace the whole of experience. He cannot embrace more than a minute fraction of the facts even of his chosen sector or aspect of history. The world of the historian, like the world of the scientist, is not a photographic copy of the real world, but rather a working model which enables him more or less effectively to understand it and to master it. The historian distills from the experience of the past, or from so much of the experience of the past as is accessible to him, that part which he recognizes as amenable to rational explanation and interpretation, and from it draws conclusions which may serve as a guide to action. A recent popular writer, speaking of the achievements of science, refers graphically to the processes of the human mind which, rummaging in the rag-bag of observed facts, selects, pieces and patterns the relevant observed facts together, rejecting the irrelevant, until it has sewn together a logical and rational quilt of knowledge. 26 With some qualification as to the dangers of undue subjectivism, I should accept that as a picture of the way in which the mind of the historian works. This procedure may puzzle and shock philosophers, and even some historians. But it is perfectly familiar to ordinary people going about the practical business of life. Let me illustrate. Jones, returning from a party at which he has consumed more than his usual ration of alcohol, in a car whose brakes turn out to have been defective, at a blind corner where visibility is notoriously poor, knocks down and kills Robinson, who was crossing the road to buy cigarettes at the shop on the corner. After the mess has been cleared up, we meet, say, at local police headquarters, to inquire into the causes of the occurrence. Was it due to the driver's semi-intoxicated condition, in which case there might be criminal prosecution? Or was it due to the defective brakes, in which case something might be said to the garage which overhauled the car only the week before? Or was it due to the blind corner, in which case the road authorities might be invited to give the matter their attention? While we are discussing these practical questions, two distinguished gentlemen, I shall not attempt to identify them, burst into the room and begin to tell us, with great fluency and cogency, that, if Robinson had not happened to run out of cigarettes that evening, he would not have been crossing the road and would not have been killed, that Robinson's desire for cigarettes was therefore the cause of his death, and that any enquiry which neglects this cause will be a waste of time, and any conclusions drawn from it meaningless and futile. Well, what do? As soon as we can break into the flow of eloquence, we edge our two visitors gently but firmly towards the door, we instruct the janitor on no account to admit them again, and we get on with our enquiry. But what answer have we to the interrupters? Of course, Robinson was killed because he was a cigarette smoker. Everything that the devotees of chance and contingency in history say is perfectly true and perfectly logical. It has the kind of remorseless logic which we find in Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. But, while I yield to none in my admiration for these ripe examples of Oxford scholarship, I prefer to keep my different modes of logic in separate compartments. The Dodgsonian mode is not the mode of history. History therefore is a process of selection in terms of historical significance. To borrow Talcott Parsons's phrase once more, history is a selective system, not only of cognitive, but of causal, orientations to reality. Just as from the infinite ocean of facts the historian selects those which are significant for his purpose, so from the multiplicity of sequences of cause and effect he extracts those, and only those, which are historically significant, and the standard of historical significance is his ability to fit them into his pattern of rational explanation and interpretation. Other sequences of cause and effect have to be rejected as accidental, not because the relation between cause and effect is different, but because the sequence itself is irrelevant. The historian can do nothing with it, it is not amenable to rational interpretation, and has no meaning either for the past or the present. It is true that Cleopatra's nose, or Bajazet's gout, or Alexander's monkey bite, or Lenin's death, or Robinson's cigarette smoking, had results. But it makes no sense as a general proposition to say that generals lose battles because they are infatuated with beautiful queens, or that wars occur because kings keep pet monkeys, or that people get run over and killed on the roads because they smoke cigarettes. If on the other hand you tell the ordinary man that Robinson was killed because the driver was drunk, or because the brakes did not work, or because there was a blind corner on the road, this will seem to him a perfectly sensible and rational explanation. If he chooses to discriminate, he may even say that this, and not Robinson's desire for cigarettes, was the real cause of Robinson's death. Similarly, if you tell the student of history that the struggles in the Soviet Union in the 1920s were due to discussions about the rate of industrialization, or about the best means of inducing the peasants to grow grain to feed the towns, or even to the personal ambitions of rival leaders, he will feel that these are rational and historically significant explanations in the sense that they could also be applied to other historical situations, and that they are real causes of what happened in the sense that the accident of Lenin's premature death was not. He may even, if he is given to reflection on these things, be reminded of Hegel's much-quoted and much misunderstood dictum in the introduction to the philosophy of right that, what is rational is real, and what is real is rational. Let us return for a moment to the causes of Robinson's death. We had no difficulty in recognizing that some of the causes were rational and real, and that others were irrational and accidental. But by what criterion did we make the distinction? The faculty of reason is normally exercised for some purpose. Intellectuals may sometimes reason, or think that they reason, for fun. But, broadly speaking, human beings reason to an end. And when we recognized certain explanations as rational, and other explanations as not rational, we were, I suggest, distinguishing between explanations which served some end and explanations which did not. In the case under discussion, it made sense to suppose that the curbing of alcoholic indulgence in drivers, or a stricter control over the condition of brakes, or an improvement in the sighting of roads, might serve the end of reducing the number of traffic fatalities. But it made no sense at all to suppose that the number of traffic fatalities could be reduced by preventing people from smoking cigarettes. This was the criterion by which we made our distinction. And the same goes for our attitude to causes in history. There, too, we distinguish between rational and accidental causes. The former, since they are potentially applicable to other countries, other periods and other conditions, lead to fruitful generalizations and lessons can be learned from them. They serve the end of broadening and deepening our understanding. 27 Accidental causes cannot be generalized, and, since they are in the fullest sense of the word unique, they teach no lessons and lead to no conclusions. But here I must make another point. It is precisely this notion of an end in view which provides the key to our treatment of causation in history, and this necessarily involves value judgments. Interpretation in history is, as we saw in the last lecture, always bound up with value judgments, and causality is bound up with interpretation. In the words of Meinecke, the great Meinecke, the Meinecke of the 1920s, the search for causalities in history is impossible without reference to values. Behind the search for causalities there always lies, directly or indirectly, the search for values. 28 And this recalls what I said earlier, about the dual and reciprocal function of history, to promote our understanding of the past in the light of the present and of the present in the light of the past. Anything which, like Antony's infatuation with Cleopatra's nose, fails to contribute to this dual purpose is from the point of view of the historian dead and barren. At this juncture, it is time for me to confess to a rather shabby trick which I have played on you, though, since you will have had no difficulty in seeing through it, and since it has enabled me on several occasions to shorten and simplify what I had to say, you will perhaps have been indulgent enough to treat it as a convenient piece of shorthand. I have hitherto consistently used the conventional phrase, past and present. But, as we all know, the present has no more than a notional existence as an imaginary dividing line between the past and the future. In speaking of the present, I have already smuggled another time dimension into the argument. It would, I think, be easy to show that, since past and future are part of the same time span, interest in the past and interest in the future are interconnected. The line of demarcation between prehistoric and historical times is crossed when people cease to live only in the present, and become consciously interested both in their past and in their future. History begins with the handing down of tradition, and tradition means the carrying of the habits and lessons of the past into the future. Records of the past begin to be kept for the benefit of future generations. Historical thinking, writes the Dutch historian Huizinga, is always teleological. 29 Sir Charles Snow recently wrote of Rutherford that, like all scientists, he had, almost without thinking what it meant, the future in his bones. 30 Good historians, I suspect, whether they think about it or not, have the future in their bones. Besides the question, why, the historian also asks the question,